And then
oh, well, never mind. I apparently you cannot push certain buttons inside of StreamYard or it will cut off the countdown. So welcome everybody. I'm Jay Miller. This is the Elastic Live user group, and we are here with Seth Larson again. Seth, this is like your third time? Third time?
you just love having me on.
Yeah, I mean, the Python client is my favorite client, so that would make a lot of sense. Also, you're here to talk about what's been going on in 7.15, which I'm super excited about. I think 7.15, I've been watching kind of what's been happening from, I think all the way from like 7.12 into like 7.14 and the type hinting stuff that you've done. And then I saw the message in Slack about what was happening in 7.15, and I was like, my brain's starting to break a little bit with just a whole different API schema that you're working on, and how that's going to even involve more when we get to 8.0. So yeah, we're gonna talk about that a little bit. But before we do, as always, this is brought to you by the Elastic community. If you're watching this right now, you're on the official Elastic community YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe if you aren't already. Give the video a thumbs up so we can keep bringing Seth on to talk about us, And if you have any questions regarding what we're talking about, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're here, by the way. Tell us where you're coming from. Say hi. And if you have some questions that we can't answer or get to today, go to our Discuss forum where we have a bunch of, as I say, elasticians, technicians, and all the other issues out there that are just waiting to solve your problems. And yeah, before we jump into this last bit, I want to tell everybody about Elasticon Global. Well, let me get rid of that banner really quick. There we go. Elasticon Global, which starts next week. You can register. It is there, and you can head to elastic.co/elasticon/global and sign up today. But let's jump into this. Seth, first of all, let's review what's kind of happened in version 7 in terms of the different changes to the Elasticsearch Python client.
Yeah, so in 7.15, the first thing that is kind of, we're kind of starting to move towards what we're going to be doing with 8. And so we have a lot of plans. I published my 8.0 roadmap for the client, I think almost a month ago now, maybe a little bit more. And there's some changes in there. And so we're starting to put some kind of like light nudges in the right direction towards all of these changes, so that we don't actually have to make the upgrade from 7x to 8.0 like a really painful one. Like in theory, you should be able to write, like, as long as you're not using some really advanced low-level features of the client, you'll just be able to upgrade. And as long as you're not seeing or using any deprecated features or seeing any warnings, your code will just work, which is great. And so we're trying to like push people towards that direction, at least as much as possible. There's going to be some breakages, things that are going to just change, like things in Elasticsearch getting removed. We're not going to be able to support those in 8.0 onwards if they're removed in 8.0. But just at least in terms of client features, we're trying to make that upgrade process as smooth as possible. So.
And we've kind of seen, just even in the Python space, there's been a lot of decision making around, do we support type hinting? Is type hinting a thing? Should it be out of the box? Should it be, in core? And it seems like there's been a resounding yes, type hints are a thing that the modern Python community is excited about and wants to do. And that's something that we've kind of adopted as well, using Elasticsearch Python client easier for Python developers all over, regardless of what tool you're using, because a lot of these tools now support just the standard of type hinting.
Yeah, definitely. So we're kind of trying to use the type system a lot more. So in like 7.12, like you said, when types first got added, I don't actually remember the exact version. I think it was 7.12. we were more using them just kind of for discoverability, so like API parameter discoverability. Because before we kind of had what I like to call the keyword argument blunder, where you have the double asterisk and your IDE isn't able to help you, right? Like you don't get any hints about what is actually able to be passed to that function. And so we're like, okay, well, that is a really bad experience. How can we make that experience a little bit better? Because we still have to support Python 2. And there's a whole bunch of things that are kind of getting in the way of having this full class experience of let's type hint everything. So let's type hint some things. And so we kind of started off with discoverability. So you have optional any for a lot of different parameters where you don't actually get a type hint, but at least you know that the parameter is there. So that was where we started. And then in 7.15, now we're starting to use this new project called the Elasticsearch specification, which is essentially a complete API specification for the Elasticsearch API. Previously, we only had kind of the edges, essentially, where you'd have query parameters and path parameters, and you'd get some light typing on that, so just like the basics. But then if you're going anything beyond that, like the JSON objects in the body or new line delimited JSON for bulk indexing, all of that, you don't get any insight into that. So with this new project, we're trying to like completely cover the API as a specification. And then from that, start generating new clients starting in 8. And for Python, we're starting to use little bits of that to give even better type hint experiences. For example, like we know for a fact that that's a string as opposed to like any sort of other type that it could be. So we can hint that it's a string as opposed to just an optional any. And then in 8, we're going to start generating actual structures that you can use instead of just writing like raw JSON bodies into your queries. So then you'll get like hints deeper into the API instead of just on the surface where you'd only get the top level query parameters, path parameters. You'll actually get like, I want to build a match query as opposed to just like the top level. Here's the search, and that's all you get. And beyond that, you're kind of on your own. So we're trying to like integrate types more and more as we go along, basically, is the story.
Right. And one of the things, I mean, I'm happy, the people that are watching this and the people that are going to watch this after the fact, like anytime you throw the word changes out, like the goal is usually in any API is the changes happen behind the scenes. You don't have to change your code. In 7.15, there is kind of one big feature that changes how things should be written, I would say, kind of in the future. Does that go back and break some of the legacy code that's out there if they decide to upgrade?
Yeah, so with 7.15, one of the big things that's coming in 8 is that we're trying to move away from a body parameter. Because essentially that's like an HTTP concept. Like you really shouldn't be thinking about like, okay, what things go in the query string, what things go into the path, what things go into the HTTP body. Like that shouldn't be your concern when you're working with the Elasticsearch API. You should be more dealing with Elasticsearch features like track total hits. You don't have to care if that goes in the query string or the body. It goes in the body, but like you shouldn't have to think about that. And so we're trying to move away from basically making our users have to be experts in the Elasticsearch API to use it. And so the big thing is the body there. And so the thing that is starting to happen for a handful of the Elasticsearch APIs in 7.15 is we're deprecating the body parameter and then giving alternate ways to specify the data to that API. It won't break anything. If you use the body, it'll just issue you a deprecation warning. It'll link you to the issue, and it'll tell you kind of what you should do instead. So it's trying to be helpful there. And this is all purely just to try to get it so that when you have your code updated to 8, in theory, everything would just work, which would be a great experience as opposed to like you upgrade and then suddenly now you're tracking down, the hundreds of errors that are not, because, in 8, those things will be gone. So you won't get that nice experience of, hey, here's an issue that tells you exactly what you need to do. It'll just be, they're not here anymore because I removed them. So
That's going to take a little bit of getting used to, especially when I have to call you for like a Zoom call and it's like, hey, I feel like I'm doing this right, but I'm just getting an error. And you look and it's like you said, you look in the body and it's like, oh yeah, you see there's like a formatting error right there. And I'm like, well, yeah, these happen, I guess. But It's interesting because I think what I've been seeing, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, and this will be the last thing before we jump into some of the demo. Um, we've seen kind of this convergence of features that are in Elasticsearch DSL, and now it's kind of coming into just Elasticsearch Python, the lower level client. One of the things I like about this, though, is it makes it feel like it's an easier decision of which one to pick, because you don't, the feature set is different in only a select area. And there I'm talking about kind of that document class object that you have, or some of like the persistent save search type uh, features, where if you really need those things, DSL is great for that. But I think that the way that you're setting this up now, you can get a lot further just using the low level client to handle, your basic queries.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the actual examples, you're guessing my examples really quite nicely. Um, so there's a couple of reasons that people really like the DSL, and one of them is the declarative model, right? So you can write a search, but not ever have to think about like JSON. You just write the search and it's there. And then if you want to use it, you can use it there. And if you want to change it and like tweak it slightly, you can do that too. So if you have like a base search and then you want to like add on to it depending on certain things, you can just do that really easily. So that's like a big reason that people use the DSL. And it's unfortunate because people will ask me, okay, well, I want that, but I want it for this other part of the Elasticsearch API. So like a good one is like ingest pipelines. I want declarative ingest pipelines, or I want declarative machine learning models. And it's just like that becomes, because the DSL, and so the Elasticsearch API is huge, and it's not sustainable for me to write by hand every single part of the Elasticsearch API in a DSL-like way. Bridge that gap, right? And so declarative searches, declarative ingest pipelines, declarative.
Seth, it seems like we're having a little bit of some lag happening. Um, that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off my screen, and we'll use this as a way to kind of go into the screen share here. So let's see if we can take a second and fix this. By the way, I guess again, while we're doing that, while Seth is trying to figure out what's happening on his end, um, let me send him a message real quick. There we go. Okay, there we go. Are we back? Nope, still a little frozen. While Seth's figuring that out, let's go and remind everybody again that I don't know how much we'll be talking about Elasticsearch Python at this, but we do have the Elasticon Global coming up. So if you haven't signed up for that, be sure to check that out. It's going to be, 3 days of a lot of information, some of it talking about 8.0. Our CEO, Shai, is going to be giving a keynote. I think we have a few other keynotes, and it's not just, folks from Elastic giving talks this time around. We have folks like y'all out there listening that are going to be presenting as well. So while we're waiting on that, I am going to also throw out, we're waiting for Seth to come back, and I think he's almost there. Um, we're actually going to be showing off making that transition from 7.14 to 7.15 and some of the API changes tomorrow. I'm going to be streaming on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/KJY Miller. So if you want to see what some of this looks like and how easy it is to migrate from one to the other, feel free to stop by and hang out there. All right, Seth, are you back?
I believe so. I'm going to just disable my camera if we're going to be sharing. I wonder
Okay.
if my Wi-Fi connection is saturated. Unfortunately, there's also other video calls happening in the building right now. So
Yeah, the work from home struggles. But
Mhm.
let's share this out, and I'll also cut off my camera, and maybe that'll help with the overall stream quality as we go along. So let's do this, and I'll stop my camera and give me a mic check, Seth.
Hello, hello.
All right, we can hear you. So you've got two
Awesome.
disembodied voices. I'm Jay, and then the other voice you'll hear is Seth for those that are just joining.
Awesome. Okay. So right here, I kind of have just a little project that is already pre-configured. So I have an instance running in Elastic Cloud that I configured down here. And then don't mind a lot of this stuff. This is just to make this presentation look nice. So just to make sure that everything is working, I can run this. This is in PyCharm, by the way, if you're wondering what my IDE choice is. So we're running the client version of 7.15, just like we were discussing. And the server version is also 7.15. So we're connected to an actual Elasticsearch server. And I've loaded the Kibana sample data, just so if you want to like reproduce this yourself, you totally can. So this is
Quick
just
question about this. My assumption is if you're using Python version 7.15, do you need to be using Elasticsearch version 7.15 as well?
So that's how our compatibility matrix kind of shakes out. Essentially, clients are forward compatible. And so if you're using 7.15, you can use any server that's 7.15 plus. And then there's like additional things there when it comes to like upgrading to new majors. So I think we're saying that the last client version, so like client dot whatever the last 7 version is, will be compatible with the 8. Like you can configure it in a certain way, and you can do that like already kind of right now. But that's just for like upgrade paths. So like when you want to then upgrade to 8, you would upgrade your server to 8 with your client in compatibility mode, and then upgrade your client after that, like after you get things working, because you'd have to make actual code changes at that point. So that's kind of like the upgrade path, if that makes sense.
Yep.
All right. So yeah, so this is just kind of making sure. So let's start with the kind of the things that are being deprecated, right? So this, we're importing like my pre-configured client. So this is just like an Elasticsearch client. You can use it normally. One of the things that's getting deprecated in 7.15, which is already out, is the keyword arguments. So this applies to all APIs. All APIs need to be using keyword arguments. And so if you were to run this example, it still works and everything. Like you actually do get a response. I actually don't print it out, but if you get, so this is just like a pretty print function. This is actually using the rich library. If you've heard of that, it just makes things kind of nice. You can actually see the bounds nicely. But you can see here at the top, it says there's a deprecation warning. And if you actually click on that, it'll show you this is the line that the deprecation warning is originating from. And it's saying using positional arguments for APIs is deprecated and will be disabled in 8.0. So the reason that we're seeing this is because this argument here is positional. So it's not a keyword argument. So you have to do something like this. And that might kind of seem like weird that you would have to do it. So the real reason that this is happening is because in 7x, there is a parameter called doctype, which actually you don't even have this in there because I think this is generated from a client that doesn't even have that. So there used to be a thing called doctype where you'd have to do like get doctype equals whatever. You can have this be anything. And then you'd have your index be separate, right? And the thing is that this would work in 7x if you were to just do this as well, because in the URL, this is the order of things. It's doctype and then index, and doctype being optional. And so this would work in 7x, but when you go to upgrade to 8, this parameter would normally be there in 7 is removed in 8. And that's bad because then this is just kind of randomly getting assigned to whatever was in that location. And then this is getting assigned to something that's probably not what you want to get assigned to as well. And so this is like just a big reason to just use keyword arguments kind of everywhere. I would actually say like there's a lot of places that I just think that keyword arguments should be used everywhere, unless it's functions like built-ins that take only one argument or something like that. So that's kind of something that we're adding to make it so that you're guaranteed that your APIs are going to be good, like the usage is going to be fine. And then in the future, if API parameters get removed or added, even as like backwards compatible way, or if there's the next major, you'll just definitely get a good experience no matter what. Like it'll complain that the parameter is not there instead of just silently passing your arguments to different places, which you definitely don't want. So that's kind of like the reasoning behind that. So Another thing that's getting deprecated is, so I mentioned a lot to Jay about the body parameter. Like we just want to move away from this in general. And so there's two cases for the body parameter that we need to like handle. And so one of the cases is you have a JSON body, and each of the top level arguments in that JSON body are fields that you want to be parameters essentially. And then the other one is you have a body that is kind of just, the body itself is the parameter. So in this case, we're indexing a document, right? This is the index API. We're indexing into an index. And so if we were to like run this, let's run this, we'll also similarly get a deprecation warning saying the body parameter is deprecated for the index API. So this change is only applied to a very small subset of APIs in 7.15. In 7.16, there might be a couple more APIs that I add. This is kind of just to like slowly move towards this, as opposed to just like dropping a huge deprecation warnings coming out everywhere for everybody. And another reason why is just because the Elasticsearch specification needs to be like perfect for an API to be able to allow it in 7x, which is not the case for all the APIs. There's still work to be done in some places. But for the index API, we don't want body because this is not really semantic, right? Like this is just an HTTP request body. We don't know what this actually represents. And so the error message actually recommends what you should change it to. It says, instead use the document parameter. And so if you change this to document, because what we are indexing is a document, and we index that, we won't get a deprecation warning. So all the APIs that have a body, that the body itself is the parameter, will have a named body is kind of what I call it. And so another index of this is like create. So if you do create, it's the same thing, document. So in the second case of like removing a body, you have, for example, a search. So if I make this a little bit bigger, because searches tend to be a little bit bigger. So here we have a search, and you have a body which has a query, and it has aggregations. So if we run this and show off what the deprecation warning, so we do get a result. Didn't match anything, unfortunately. But the deprecation warning, it says the body parameter is deprecated. Instead, use API parameters directly. So what does that mean? And there's an example of this in the linked issue as well. But essentially, what it's asking is, OK, so these are parameters to a search query. And so instead of typing out a whole body in JSON, what you would do is you would just say query equals, and then whatever you would put in the query section of my copy paste skills are failing me. So whatever you'd put in a query for a search, you just put it at the top level. And the same thing for aggregations. So if you had ags, which is down here, and if you run this, it'll do the exact same thing. It'll just make the search, and it'll construct the body within the actual API like itself. It'll construct the body. And the nice thing about this is that you don't have to think about where any of these pieces go. You just use them, and it'll just work out how it should. Exactly. So in a lot of cases, query parameters can also go in the body and vice versa. So for example, like track total hits. If you're using it in like a pre-714 or before, if you use it this way, it'll always go in the query parameter. But if you use it in body, it'll always go in the body. Same thing with scores, same thing with size. Like there's a lot of parameters that can go in both. And so instead of like having for you to think about that, it puts it in the best spot, which is in almost all cases is the body. Reason for that is because it benefits from gzip like HTTP compression. So like the data that's getting sent over the wire will just be less if you're able to put it in the request body instead of in the request like query parameter string or the path, which doesn't get compressed. So that's one of the big benefits of this. And this is just kind of the way that these types of, this is the majority of the APIs, how they'll be handled, where essentially everything will get pulled up into the top level. This is the one that Jay was kind of talking about, like asking where things go as opposed to like, OK, how is it formatted right? How is it formatted wrong? Like what's wrong here? And so this is kind of, you can use it this way, where you're just kind of writing a dictionary. But this is kind of like the in-between. So this is as far as we can go in 7x, essentially. In 8.0, you'll be able to go even further. Because like right now, if I were to look at the type for this, if I control into this, this is the type stub. So if I look at query, for example, it just says it's an optional mapping of string to any, which is essentially just like a JSON object with whatever value types. And so like right now, this is as far as we're able to go. But in the 8.0 version and beyond, we'll actually have like generated objects here, which will be able to like go into what is a query. Like you can actually put together a match or put together other types of filters to like get type hinting all the way down, essentially.
So that's interesting, because what I'm hearing is, for me, as someone who likes to build a lot of web projects, I tend to use, and is going to exactly tell you why I need this in my life, simple query string. Yeah, that's what it's called. It might be called something else. I could be wrong. There could be like simple query search. I can never remember. Anyway, instead of having to type that in, hey Jay, you typed in the wrong name, it's actually the other. But instead you just get an error that says, I don't know, like nothing happened here.
Right.
This is wrong. You can now put that, well, not now. Now you still have to put it inside of the query and it would still be there. But hopefully this is in preparation for an 8.0. You could just have it be at the top level. And instead you just do simple query string and then whatever your query is inside of that JSON area, and it knows where that needs to go. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah. So essentially you're putting everything at the top level. If it's top level within the documentation, because the way that the Elasticsearch documentation is written, it does kind of tell you where things go essentially, but it doesn't, like, it'll tell you mostly just about the top level. And then within, like after the top level, it gets kind of sparse. And then you might have to like go somewhere else in the documentation. So this is this matches up the Python parameters with exactly what the Elasticsearch documentation is showing as the parameters for the API, essentially. And then from there, like you'll get either doc strings or type annotations that will kind of guide you towards what you can use there. So like, for example, size, you can take integers. Query, it'll show the list of query objects that you can build starting in 8. This isn't 7.15, this is an 8, but you can have like the list of objects that you can put within query that will all themselves take parameters that you can just like plug in the data where you need it to go, and then it'll format it the way that you want, essentially. So
very nice.
All right. So this is kind of the end of the journey for what is in 7.15. So now I just want to make sure that it's clear that everything that I'm going to show is like 8.0, but also with an asterisk on it of this is not released or anything. So this is like even more experimental than experimental. So please don't like anticipate all of this being exactly the way it is that I'm showing it. So yeah, just so you know.
These are the sneak peeks of this is what you get when you come and hang out on the YouTube channel. You get to learn what we're working on on a day-to-day basis, which is why this is called the Work-with-Me AMA. So yeah, things are subject to change here, but you get to kind of know where Seth and the other developers that are working on the Python client are kind of moving towards.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of pulled off, pulled off the assembly line, essentially, this module here, Elasticsearch.types. I'm kind of envisioning that when it's actually being used, it would be Elasticsearch.types, and then you'd be able to import stuff from there. So just remember that this is just, I basically just generated this, and I pulled parts of it off, and I let it be in its own module just so I can show off some things. So essentially, I'm trying to show off, like, okay, you have a search that does a certain thing. So if I just search on an index, let me comment this out and show off what this response looks like. If I were to pretty print this and then just run that. So you get this huge object that has all the hits in it and everything, but let's just try to focus kind of on these top level things. So you get like how much time it took, whether it timed out, how many shards were involved in the search, and then the hits with some metadata. So that, like, if you're going to access that via just Python, you would have you'd grab the response object and you'd you'd almost certainly have to run the API before you even like look at it, because like you're not getting any sort of like hinting here. Like if you want hints, you would have to just know that it's double nested. And Jay does not like this. I famously know about that.
This is the one thing in Elasticsearch that I'm like, if I could fix one thing, it would be hits in all of Elasticsearch. Like, I don't know. It's one of those things that as you're working with it, the more and more that you're working with data before you present it to something, like if you you always wind up just saying results equals this hits, and then it's like results whatever. Like, so it's like, why not just get rid of that portion? But I understand there's some system stuff happening there that I can't. I'm definitely not smart enough to go in and create a nice easy way to fix that. So
I was gonna say, like, if you've heard the story of like, oh, what's the one thing that you would change if you got hired at this company and you were only going to be there for a day? What would you change? Like, you're pretty far along in that storyline. Actually, you're actually at the company.
Yeah, luckily they didn't ask me that question. I had a community answer ready to go for that.
So close, so close. Okay, so like if you basically have to run the API before you even know anything about like what's going to come out the other side, which is like super unfortunate, right? Because if this is like a destructive action or changes something, like that's not great experience. And then there's those like, you know, inconsistencies where you don't know, okay, is it shards or is it underscore shards? Like what am I going to have to do? So there's all these things that you have to think about when you're kind of using a raw dictionary as the response. And so kind of what for 8 I'm planning is that you'll still, like the raw dictionary response will kind of be the still kind of default way to do things. But what will instead happen is instead of getting just kind of like a vanilla dictionary back, you'll kind of get a dictionary-like object that kind of has like some extra superpowers on it. So I have just like this API response, and there's this search response. So this search response is actually generated from the specification. And all I'm doing is wrapping the the response that's coming back from search with an API response. You won't have to write this. I'm writing this because this is a 7.15 client. Like, it's not doing any of this magic behind the scenes right now by itself. So I'm just doing the magic basically for it. And so what this is essentially doing is it's saying, okay, this is going to be a dictionary, but it's also going to have a generic here of search response. And so what does that get us? So if we do .body here, we can see like these are Elasticsearch concepts here. So like max score and hits and scroll ID and PID ID, like all of these things could be on the body. So if I do hits here, we're essentially within this object here as sitting at like total and max score and then the other hits object. And so we can do total and we can get all of the things here, like the relation and the value. So this is basically like a lens into the Elasticsearch API that you don't really have with just a dictionary. And so like if I print this out, or if I just print out, if I just start with there just to make it more, let's do that one because it's a smaller object. In theory, I think this should just work. I mean, I think I tested it. Yeah, so look at that. You have the object that's there, but you didn't have to like know that that existed before you ran the query, which is like the big win. And then it's like the same with like shards. So you didn't have to know if it was underscore shards or just shards. We just have it as shards. Has the exact same data, and you can look into that as well. So like total is there, all of that. And then another kind of like magical part of this is that because we're generating both sides, like the request and the response, you can also have these enum values, which so a lot of people come to me and say, okay, I have this value and I don't know what the full range of things that are possible from this value. For example, like a status, like, okay, I know cluster status can be red, yellow, green, but like, what about like shard status? What else? What other statuses are there? So like enums are a really big part of the Elasticsearch API as well. So I have a couple here: total hits relation and expand wildcard options. So expand wildcards, right now, it's kind of just type annotated as either a string or a list of strings. And like that doesn't give you a lot of information about what can actually go in there. And so if you want more of like a guided experience, instead you can use an enum value or a list of enum values. So an example here is like the open expand wildcards, but if did you know you can also do expand wildcard dot none or dot all or dot closed or hidden. Like there's all of these values that are tough to find without essentially going into the documentation and reading that yourself, as opposed to just like staying in your IDE and using the API the way that you want to. So it's kind of like more of that guided experience. I think that's kind of all I had to say there. Do you have any questions, Jay?
Not a question, is more of a comment. Like, I feel like this in many ways is really trying to expand who is using not just Elasticsearch, but Elasticsearch Python. That's one of the things that I've noticed. I'm giving a talk at PyGotham this weekend. I'm not going to put that up on the screen because I wasn't prepared for it. But in that, it's kind of an idea of like, here's a new way that you can look at data using a tool like Elasticsearch. And as we've noticed with Python, as Python continues to grow, the number of different use cases for Python and the number of occupations using Python also changes. So we need to make sure that we're changing with it. And I feel like this is a great way to do that because, again, when you're talking to the people that have used Elasticsearch for the last 5 years, they're going to say, oh yeah, you do this, 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 and this. And they just know because they've done it and they've had to do it. But you're going to have so many new people, data scientists, people who are using observability, people who are using machine learning for the first time, that are going to be learning more and more about Elasticsearch and how it works. And what we have to do is write tools that kind of get out of that new user's way and give them like a portal into how you use the tool and how you use it and make it as easy as possible for them to do that.
Exactly, yeah. Type hints are definitely like a feature that was made for making like that newcomer experience like just way better, because IDEs nowadays are like super smart and there's tons of tooling around typing and it's like not even really in your face. Like you don't have to use a tool to know, like if I were to pass in like something wrong here, like your IDE can just tell you that it's wrong, as opposed to like you having to find out when you go to run your code. And there's like correctness check, like there's just so much stuff that makes the experience of using the library better. And I really like your point about like optimizing for like a newcomer experience. Like that's definitely what we're trying to do here, where it's like instead of having to trip over the Elasticsearch API, because the actual API, like if you look at the whole of it, it is very large. There's like tons of it. There's parts of it I don't know everything about either. Even as like it's my job to know as much as possible about the API. So like imagine a newcomer experience. Like we're definitely trying to make that as nice as possible with just the base client and not having to install like the DSL just to do searches, but then you're on your own for other things, like trying to make the whole experience nice.
And I guess the only other thing with that is we're not necessarily doing things that, well, I guess in this case, we are doing some things that are exclusive to the Python client because we're utilizing Python structures to make this work. But our goal is hopefully to do this for all the clients,
Oh,
as
definitely.
we have to make sure that everything is compatible with 8.0. But at the same time, it's like, how can we use the features that the language gives us to provide a better experience for the people using those languages?
Right. Yeah, no, there's serializers and all of these different like language specific things that you get with the Python client. And then the Elasticsearch specification itself, we kind of like highlight different places where you might want to do something special for, like, for example, in TypeScript, there's not a like specific integer type, it's just number. But then we'll like hint like, oh, by the way, this is not like a float. It's always going to be an integer. And so, your client may have to handle that differently. And things like date string, where we have native date time or date to Elasticsearch compatible formats for dates, like serialization. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we do there that is just like for you, just to make the experience nicer. Like you can just use date times as opposed to having to know how to serialize into a certain format or something like that. So
Yeah, it looks like you got one last example here, so
I
I
do.
want to know more about that.
Yeah, so this one is, there's nothing about this in 7.15 right now, but this is kind of like something that we need to do as a part of making this API, like this is the API call, right? Like anything that's in here should be API related. It shouldn't be transport related. And so confusingly, there is some parameters that are in there just as kind of like a per request basis. For example, ignore is the one I'm going to use, for example, here, which is essentially, if I get this status code back, I don't want to raise an exception. I just want the response deserialized, essentially. And so if we were to, like, let's see, not an index, use this as it stands right now, we'll get just a deserialized response, which is totally fine. The actual behavior of this is not the problem. The problem is that we have a lot of these. So there's like API key, there's like authentication, there's timeouts, there's a whole bunch of stuff that can go in here, but it's not, none of them are API related. They just happen to kind of coexist with the API. And so instead, like the way that I'm planning on solving this is essentially taking kind of a note out of the DSL library. They have something that's kind of like a builder pattern. And so you'll be able to configure a like contextualized client here with just putting a couple of options. For example, like the ignore. It's also ignore status instead of just ignore, because if you just say ignore, that doesn't really describe what is going to go in there as a parameter. So this is kind of what it'll look like in 8, where you have like this contextualized client, and you can pass more than just ignore status. You can do like timeouts, you can do authentication, so API key is there. And then so this client instance that you get will have all of these settings applied to it. And so if you want to do multiple requests, like within a function or something like that, you can have that one client just be, you can essentially like reassign it. So you can do this. And then that client instance, it won't be like the transport will be the same. So the transport will be shared across all client instances that you built. But then the just parameters that will get passed as to the transport layer will be different for this contextualized client. And so like when you then call search, it'll ignore all 404s. It won't raise an error. So this is basically the exact same that I had written before. It'll just show it back. And so this is kind of another piece of the whole 8.0 thing where we're trying to, something I didn't even show off over here. We have the body, but we also have .meta. So meta will show kind of transport layer stuff off, because right now you don't get any access at all to these transport layer things. So like the status code, the headers, the HTTP version, the TLS version, how long it took, all like the duration, all of that. You don't get any access to that at the API level. But there's a lot of reasons why you would actually want that type of access at the API level, like people that are doing tracing, people that are want to know about the performance of the client, all of these different things. And so resp.meta. If I do status, if I also print out the headers, you can kind of see what this might look like. But there's also other things that are probably going to be coming to this. But this also ties into the whole transport layer. So like you can see the HTTP headers and the status as well. So this is kind of like, okay, can we both make the layers the way that they're supposed to be, like nice and distinct? So the transport layer stuff happens here. API level, like layered architecture stuff happens here. And then also make all layers that you would be interested in available at the API level. Like just opt in, you want that data, you can just get it. As opposed to you having to like go out and make your own custom thing, which is what you have to do for 7x, unfortunately. So yeah, it's the more complicated like rationale essentially, but basically it's just making all the API level stuff be in its own place, and then making all the transport level stuff be in its own place, so that we don't have to worry about conflicts essentially. Does that make sense to you, Jay?
It does, and the only questions that I would have had for that is, will this work? I see right now you're overriding your existing client. Could you have multiple like client specifications to where you can say, base client is my normal authentication and everything else that I would need for establishing the connection, and then you could have, sender template, which has certain options enabled, and then you could have retrieval template, which has other options enabled. Like, is that kind of the idea here, to where now instead of saying client and then of course client single options, you could just say, hey, all the settings that I use for retrieving data, go retrieve the data, and then all the settings I use for uploading data, go upload the data, and then I don't have to. It's the same client, but it's multiple instances with different options set.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've got it exactly right. Where you can have, it's the same client, same transport, all the same nodes are being used, but then just depending on which like instance you're using within Python, you can have different authentication levels. You can have, if you have custom headers for whatever reason set, yeah, it basically exactly what you said. It works exactly the way you would want it to, where you can have different authentication levels using this feature of dot options.
And of course, I know we're kind of fortune telling here, but is this going to work in compatibility with some of the other Python tools that we have? My personal favorite being Elant.
So when you say work with, what do you mean?
In terms of using like the client options and having
Oh,
that
okay. Yeah,
be
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So this is basically just a client that just has slightly different options. So you'd be able to just pass this to Elant right away, and it would work just fine.
and I guess maybe that does lead into another question that kind of popped into my head there. Um, I know with Elant we have that ES search and like ES match, kind of those different parameters that are utilizing the Elasticsearch API. Are some of these changes that you have with generated or with the named bodies, is that going to translate over to that as well, or are you still going to need to know kind of how the Elasticsearch query is structured to use some of those features?
Yeah, so the generated types, one of the nice things about this is that because it's a part of the base client, any like software that wants to take on the Elasticsearch client as a dependency can also use all of the types. And so that'll be used both internally within the client for like helpers. I plan on making some new helpers that actually take advantage of these types as opposed to just returning raw things, which is what the 7x helpers do. And then like Elant, for example, can take advantage of this also. So like it can say, I want, like, for example, you said ES search. It can say in its type signature, I want a like query object, or I want an aggregation object, or because you can essentially say, I want filters, as opposed to saying, just give me some JSON blob that happens to be Elasticsearch filters. So yeah, I plan on kind of pushing this outwards as well, and not just keeping it contextualized to clients and users only. Like in theory, these types should be super useful outside of just the client itself.
And I guess this is the time to promote that again, as we've talked about, kind of the last two examples are more of what's to come in 8.0. But if you want to, get in on the ground and maybe make a couple of contributions and help with some of the discussion as to how we should implement this, you can head over to the GitHub repo for Elasticsearch Pi and make sure you submit an issue. And if you are looking for a list of all of the changes that came with 7.15, we do have those as well in issue 1696.
Yeah, both of the issues that have like the 8.0 roadmap and the 7.15 newly deprecated things that are pushing towards 8.0, both of those issues are pinned. So if you just go to the repository, you can find the issues really nicely there.
Awesome. Oh, cool. Is there anything else that you wanted to reveal?
Yeah, the only other thing, which is essentially like Python support, Python version support. So in 7x, we kind of just let the Python versions be supported, like just all of them. So anything that was supported in 7.0 just continued to be supported in 7x all the way up until when they're far past end of lifetime. I think we're going to start trying to take the approach of like, once this is very much end of life, we might get like deprecate it and then eventually get rid of it in a major. So we've dropped these three Python versions, Python 2.7, 3.4, and 3.5. And then 3.6 is actually getting close to end of life, but we're not going to drop it. Our usage is still pretty high for it. And so I would just make sure to know that like this having everything be supported for 7x for the entire lifetime of 7x, it's what we would like to do that, but it's also really nice to be able to take advantage of new features. For example, like in 3.6, we have f strings, which are way faster than string formatting. Keyword only arguments came in Python 3.0, and so we wouldn't be able to do any of that without dropping 2.7. Guaranteed that there's going to be new features in newer Python versions that we're going to want to take advantage of. So like down the line, this isn't anything that's happening in 8.0, but like 8 later, there may be like dropping of 3.6 eventually when it's like a few years off of being end of life. So that's kind of like a new thing that we're kind of talking about. But then, yeah, this is just kind of like examples of what you actually predicted with the declarative nature of these types. So instead of having to like type all of this as JSON, you can just type this as like an object, essentially. Like this is one big, huge range aggregation object. And then given your ranges, which are also objects that are kind of guiding you how to do things, like this brings the declarative nature of Elasticsearch DSL without needing that dependency. And this is kind of like how that would look like with ingest pipelines, which is a really requested feature that I get from a lot of people. Like I want Elasticsearch DSL, but for ingest pipelines, like this is what that would look like. And to be honest, this is not too far off of what it would actually look like in Elasticsearch DSL. Like it would look almost identical to this. So it's really nice to have that in the base client as opposed to like its own dependency. So
absolutely. And going back to the deprecation of certain, Python versions, we actually look too, like we look at what our usage is, and obviously if there were a huge portion of people that were saying, hey, I use Python 3.4, like why are you doing this, like there might be a question of like, okay, why, and then also do we need to make that decision. But as you've mentioned, it's like most of these, I mean 2.7, we know 2.7 has been gone for 2 years now. 3.4 and 3.5 I think are gone this year, and then like you said 3.6
3.5 has been gone for a while. 3.4 has been gone for a really long time. 3.5 I think has been gone for about the same amount of time as 2.7.
Yeah, so we're giving people time. I know it's like you only see like 2 versions here. We also have to remember Python is also on 3.9 with 3.10 on the way.
I think out in the next day or maybe even today, 3.10.
Yeah. So yeah, like there's still plenty of versions for folks, and as we kind of mentioned at the beginning, the idea here isn't to break things for people. We often recommend that people update the Python client as they're updating Elasticsearch. But what you do is you update Elasticsearch first, put everything in compatibility mode, and then go back and update clients, unless I got that backwards.
Yep, no, you're totally right.
Okay, perfect.
Server first.
Yeah, server first. So hopefully if you're following kind of the guidance that the engineering team provides in these steps, nothing should, knock on whatever this composite material is, you shouldn't have too much of a hard time there. But again, this is where I shamelessly plug things because that's what I'm here for. If you do run it, go to the forum and be sure to let people know, hey, I'm having this issue. Can someone help me? And usually the answer is, if we can't directly help you, we can point you to information that can help you in that process. But that being said, like I think this is all awesome, Seth. I know that right now we're trying to stay cameras off for sake of internet. I am personally looking forward to this. Like I said, tomorrow I'm doing probably a 2-hour live stream on my Twitch channel to just go through my projects and say, is this running Elasticsearch 7.15? If it is, let's upgrade it to I'm gonna cut your camera off because it looks like you're lagging again. Oh no, you're good. Yeah, I'm gonna be coming back to some of the projects that I have. If I'm running 7.15 on the Elasticsearch side, which I am, then let's get the Python clients updated and let's get some of this code changed over so we can have a more realistic experience for what's going to be happening in the next several months.
Sounds good.
Well, awesome. Well, everyone, there we go. Camera back on. Well, everyone, that's going to wrap it up for this live stream. Thank you again so much, Seth. As he has here on the screen, there's his Twitter handle. Be sure to go reach out to him there. I think that's also on LinkedIn. So if that's what you do, do that. And of course, I guess the administrative stuff is there won't be a live stream next week because on Wednesday it is the start of Elasticon Global. So we're going to be doing a lot of work. I've been on kind of helping with some of the talks there. So we're going to be focusing a lot on that and getting that out. If you aren't signed up yet, head to this link. Be sure to go sign up there. There's going to be a lot of great talks and a lot of great things. But we'll be coming in the following week with another great live stream. Be sure to also follow Elastic on Twitter, on all the socials. Sometimes you'll see my face. I will leave it at that. When we talk about the upcoming events, sometimes my face pops up. And if that scares you, well, I'm sorry. But if not, hey, it's a thing. But I think that's going to wrap it up for this week. And until next time, take care, everybody.